Hey, come on over here for me, man. No, get out the car. Come here. Get out the car. Turn around for him, put your hands behind your back. Alright? So right now you're just being detained, okay? Stop! Get the out! Get out! On your way! Get out! On your way! Now you're just being detained, okay? Stop! Get the out! Get out! On your way!
The surveillance footage is grainy, but chillingly clear. A young woman steps out of a Houston bar, her smile faint beneath the fluorescent streetlight. She walks toward a white van, its engine humming quietly like a predator waiting in the shadows. She climbs inside. Minutes pass. Then, an hour. The van doesn't move. When it finally does, DeAndrea Ford, a two-year-old mother, will never be seen alive again. Months later, bones scatter in a ditch 240 miles away. A single question lingers. Was this murder an act of cold calculation, or the tragic fate of a young woman society had already failed to protect? Houston, Texas, a city buzzing with nightlife, neon lights, and the hum of traffic that never sleeps. But beneath the energy lies another reality, one of survival, where women like DeAndrea Ford walked a tightrope between danger and necessity every single night. DeAndrea was young, beautiful, and full of dreams. A devoted mother raising her little boy, she juggled jobs, hustled for tips, and clung to the hope that all her sacrifices might one day buy him a better life. To her grandmother, she was a bright soul, with a laugh that lit up the room. To her son, she was simply Mommy, the center of his world. But in the months before her disappearance, the shadows began to close in. Threats whispered her name. A murder trial loomed, and DeAndrea was caught in the middle. Would she live long enough to testify, or was her fate already sealed? DeAndrea Ford was born in 2001, raised by her grandmother, Bridget, who became her anchor in a turbulent world. From the beginning, life asked more of her than it does of most. By the age of 16, she was already a mother, learning the weight of responsibility while her peers were still dreaming of proms and summer breaks. Every paycheck, every shift, every decision revolved around her son's future. By her late teens, she worked wherever she could find, opportunity restaurants, odd jobs, and eventually the nightlife scene. She was drawn to dancing, posting videos on TikTok with carefree energy, a side of her that clashed with the pressures she endured daily. To outsiders, her choices drew judgment, but to those who loved her, DeAndrea was simply doing what she could to survive in a world that left her little room for error. When she began working at DA's Bikini Bar in Houston, she found stability of sorts, fast money, a new crowd, and a chance to keep the lights on at home. Yet, danger lingered in the corners of her life. The whispers weren't just gossip. They were warnings. Months before her disappearance, DeAndrea found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the early morning of May 18th, 2023. She was dozing in the passenger seat of a car after a work trip from Louisiana. Her manager, a man named Otis Parker, a figure who connected women to clients and took a cut of their earnings, was behind the wheel. Suddenly, gunfire shattered the night. Parker slumped forward, fatally struck. DeAndrea woke to chaos, blood everywhere. But this wasn't a random attack. Police later discovered it was a setup. 4 people, including one of DeAndrea's own co-workers, had plotted to rob Parker for the $1,500 they carried from that night's work. The betrayal ran deep. Someone DeAndrea trusted had helped orchestrate the ambush. Investigators pieced it together and made arrests. Court documents revealed a chilling text from one of the suspects. "She ain't safe in Houston at all." The she was DeAndrea. She was the sole witness who could testify to what happened that night. She had seen it all. The courts knew the risk. A judge granted her a no-contact order, an official acknowledgement that her life was in danger. But in reality, it was just a piece of paper. No relocation, no protection, no safe house. DeAndrea remained in Houston, juggling bills, working nights, and trying to shield her son from the fear creeping into her every step. The summer of 2023 came and went. One of the suspects was killed in a shootout with police, but 3 remained in jail, facing capital murder charges. Their futures hung on DeAndrea's testimony. If she took the stand, their chances of walking free were slim, and they knew it. By September, DeAndrea had only been working at DAS for 2 weeks when a new face walked in. He was older, quiet, calm. Surveillance cameras captured their interaction near closing time. They talked softly. She smiled, nodded, and eventually agreed to leave with him. To her friends, it was routine. Another ride home, another late-night arrangement. At 1:30 a.m., the cameras caught her walking out to a white Ford Transit van with New Jersey plates. She climbed inside, sliding toward the back. The van stayed parked in silence. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. Finally, at 2:30 a.m., the headlights flickered on. The van drove away. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. When DeAndrea didn't come home, her grandmother grew frantic. Calls went unanswered. Days later, the family filed a missing persons report. Flyers blanketed Houston. Friends and relatives organized search parties, desperate for answers. Weeks dragged into months. No body, no phone signals, no trace. The silence was unbearable. Then, in November, investigators in Dallas found the van abandoned in a lot. Inside were multiple cell phones, clothing, and something far more chilling: blood. Luminol testing revealed stains everywhere on the floor, on the walls, on a ratchet strap hanging from the interior. DNA confirmed the blood belonged to DeAndrea, but it wasn't hers alone. Another man's DNA was mixed with it. The evidence told a horrific story. A violent struggle, a young woman fighting desperately for her life. The fingerprints in the van led to a man named lled Washington, a 51-year-old with a history stretching back decades. Court records painted a picture of a predator: assaults, kidnappings, and a pattern of targeting women in the sex trade, stretching as far back as 1987. Police questioned him. He admitted meeting DeAndrea but claimed he dropped her off safely. Faced with the DNA evidence, he simply lawyered up. And then, despite everything, police let him go. To this day, one haunting question lingers. Did lled Washington kill DeAndrea because she was a witness in a capital murder case? Or was she simply the latest victim in his decades-long hunt for vulnerable women? The answer lies in that silent hour, the one where the van sat motionless before driving away. What happened inside? Was she negotiating, hesitating, or already fighting for her life? We may never truly know. But the horror of it hangs heavy, a reminder of how fragile protection can be when the system fails. The discovery of the van should have been the turning point. When Dallas police uncovered the abandoned white Ford Transit, it was like unearthing a tomb on wheels. The smell of bleach hung in the air, the kind of chemical stench that only means one thing: someone had tried to erase the truth. Inside, they found her clothing, her belongings, her blood, and not just hers. Mixed with the young mother's DNA was that of a man who had been haunting women for nearly 4 decades. His name was Yolande Washington, and to investigators, his fingerprints read like a confession. The walls of the van lit up with luminol, glowing like blue fire in the dark, exposing what someone had hoped would stay hidden forever. Patterns of blood told a chilling story. Someone had been restrained, someone had struggled, and someone had lost. On a ratchet strap, there were smears. On the floor, splatters and pools. Across clothing, streaks of 2 lives colliding in violence. It was as if the vehicle itself had become a crime scene, frozen in time, silently screaming the truth about what happened inside. When detectives ran the fingerprints, the past came rushing back. Washington wasn't just another suspect. His history traced all the way back to 1987 inches, Los Angeles, when he was charged with kidnapping and raping a woman named Chandler Washington, a case so brutal it had carried the possibility of a death sentence. He had a documented pattern of preying on women, particularly those who worked in nightlife, sex work, or places where society often looked away when something went wrong. Over the decades, he had perfected his method. Lure women with money, get them alone, and then unleash a storm of violence. Sometimes they survived, sometimes they didn't. The truth is, Washington should never have been free. He had been given chance after chance, slipping through cracks in a justice system that seemed unable or unwilling to treat him as the predator he was. And yet, despite all this, despite the blood in his van, despite the surveillance footage that showed DeAndrea climbing into his vehicle and never climbing out, despite the evidence screaming that this man was a danger, detectives released him. They had questioned him, they had pushed, but when he asked for a lawyer, the interview ended. They let him walk away. For DeAndrea's family, the news was devastating. It was as if justice had been dangled before them, only to be ripped away at the last second. Her grandmother Bridget could barely speak when she was told. Her uncle Kevin was furious. How could they let him go? They had her blood in his van. What more did they need? The community was outraged too. Protests began outside police stations. The media pressed for answers. Why was a man with a 36-year history of violence allowed to walk free, while the family of a missing young mother was left to beg for scraps of information? Detectives told them they were waiting on DNA results, waiting for something more concrete. But to the family, it felt like an excuse. They had been asked to bring DeAndrea's little boy to provide a DNA sample, a request that cut deeper than words could explain. The implication was horrifying. Police needed the boy's DNA to confirm what everyone already feared, that the blood in Washington's van belonged to his mother. Imagine the weight of that request. The unspoken confirmation that the justice system believed DeAndrea was already gone, yet still allowed the man who likely killed her to roam free. Weeks stretched into months. Washington, now aware he was under suspicion, lived openly in Dallas. He walked the same streets, ate in the same diners, existed as if he hadn't been the last person seen with a young mother who vanished into the night. For DeAndrea's family, it was torture. They didn't just lose her. They had to watch the man suspected of taking her life, enjoy his freedom, while their lives were permanently broken. Then, in early January 2024, the results came back. The stains in the van confirmed the nightmare. The DNA was hers. Not only that, mixed samples revealed Washington's own blood, proof of a violent struggle. Forensic experts explained the implications. DeAndrea had fought back, fought so hard that she injured him, leaving his DNA imprinted on her final moments. It was a heartbreaking revelation, one that showed her courage, her refusal to go quietly. She hadn't just been a victim. She had resisted with every ounce of strength she had left. Armed with that evidence, prosecutors finally moved. On January 11, 2024, Yolande Washington was arrested and charged with the murder of DeAndrea Ford. He was taken into custody during an early morning raid in Dallas, this time held without bond, awaiting extradition to Harris County. The relief was overwhelming, but bittersweet. For her grandmother, the news didn't bring closure. She told reporters, "We still don't have her. We can't bury her. We can't say goodbye." And perhaps worst of all, her 4-year-old son still asked when his mother was coming home, a question nobody in the family knew how to answer. But the story didn't end there, because the case was tangled in 2 possible motives. The first, witness elimination. The suspects in the capital murder of her manager, Otis Parker, had already threatened her life. Court documents confirmed they knew she could testify against them, and a chilling text spelled it out clearly: "She ain't safe in Houston at all." Was Washington hired to silence her? Was this calculated to ensure she never took the stand? Or was it something even more tragic? That DeAndrea had simply crossed paths with a predator who had been hunting women like her for nearly 40 years. A man who didn't need to know she was a witness, who didn't need a reason beyond the opportunity her job and vulnerability provided. Investigators scoured Washington's connections, looking for ties to the Parker case: phone records, bank transfers, messages, anything that could link him to the suspects awaiting trial. But nothing emerged. No payments, no communication, no evidence that he was working for someone else. The chilling conclusion was that DeAndrea had been caught in the middle of 2 storms, one documented, one random, and it was the random one that struck first. She wasn't silenced by the people she feared. She was taken by a man who had been hunting women long before her name was ever written on a court document. This revelation left everyone unsettled, because if Washington hadn't been hired, if this wasn't about the capital murder case, then it meant something far more terrifying. DeAndrea wasn't targeted because of what she had witnessed. She was targeted because she was a woman working late at night, because she was vulnerable, because society has always treated women like her as disposable, and Washington knew it. He had counted on it. By March 2024, the case had stalled again. Washington was behind bars, but without a body. Conviction seemed fragile. Defense attorneys circled like vultures, ready to argue that there was no proof she was truly dead. The van, the DNA, the history, all damning, but in the absence of her remains, doubt could still creep into a jury's mind. Prosecutors braced for an uphill battle. Meanwhile, DeAndrea's family lived in a cruel limbo. Her grandmother kept her room exactly as it had been, her son sometimes curling up on her pillow at night, clinging to her scent. Every week, her Uncle Kevin updated social media, refusing to let her face fade from the public eye. And then, the unthinkable happened. On March 15, 2024, a utility worker in Dallas stumbled across human bones in a drainage culvert off Luna Road. Scattered, weathered, almost hidden by time, The remains were collected and sent to forensic experts for identification. The process took months, but on September 17, 2024, the results came back. It was her. It was DeAndrea. She had been lying in that ditch for half a year while her family searched, while Washington lived freely in the same city, while the system debated whether her life was worth enough evidence to act. The discovery broke her family. Bridget collapsed when she heard the confirmation. She had known in her heart, but knowing and hearing it officially were two different kinds of pain. Now they could bury her. Now they could say goodbye. But the questions didn't end. They only grew sharper, more haunting. Who failed DeAndrea Ford? Was it the justice system that gave her nothing more than a piece of paper for protection? Was it society that forced her into dangerous work just to survive? Or was it all of us, for allowing predators like Yolande Washington to roam free for decades, leaving women like DeAndrea unprotected in the shadows? This is only the second chapter of DeAndrea's story, and what comes next will force us to confront the failures that allowed this tragedy to happen. Failures that reach far beyond one man, one van, or one night in Houston. The confirmation of DeAndrea's remains should have been the end of the nightmare, but for her family, it only opened a new chapter of pain. Knowing where she was, knowing what had happened, didn't bring peace. It brought a brutal finality. Her grandmother, Bridget, clutched her son's hand when they buried her, whispering that Mommy was safe now, that she was resting. But deep inside, she knew nothing about this was safe or restful. It was tragedy, plain and unshakable. And the real fight had only just begun. Washington was now charged with capital murder, the weight of Texas justice bearing down on him. Prosecutors considered the death penalty, arguing that the brutality of the crime and his history of violence left no other option. Yet, even with the DNA, the van, the surveillance footage, and his decades-long record, one question remained inescapable. Would a jury convict without hesitation? Defense attorneys clung to every shred of doubt, circling the missing pieces of the story like sharks. They pointed to the absence of clear video of the crime itself, to the possibility of another unknown assailant, to the cruel reality that no camera had captured the moment her life was taken. For DeAndrea's family, the thought of Washington escaping justice was unbearable. They had seen this system fail before. They had watched how predators like him managed to walk free for years, blending back into society after leaving bodies in their wake. Bridget sat in her living room night after night, staring at the news coverage, shaking her head in disbelief. How could a man accused of such horrific crimes in 1987, a man who had attacked women again in the decades since, be free to take her granddaughter's life in 2023? It was the same story she heard, whispered among neighbors, at community vigils, at the marches they organized in DeAndrea's name. The system wasn't built to protect women like her, and yet, the community refused to stay silent. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs that bore DeAndrea's smiling face, chanting her name outside police stations and courthouses. They demanded answers, demanded accountability, demanded that women who worked at night, who danced in clubs, who took risky jobs to feed their families, be seen as human beings worth protecting. Every life matters, they said, and every woman deserves safety. The media coverage spread beyond Houston. National outlets picked up the story, framing it not just as a murder, but as a symptom of something larger, an epidemic of violence against women in vulnerable professions, and a justice system that too often looked the other way until it was too late. Experts appeared on talk shows, dissecting how witness protection had failed, how prior cases against Washington had collapsed, how society's judgment of women like DeAndrea had allowed her to fall through the cracks. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors pieced together the most chilling version of events they could reconstruct. They laid out the timeline: DeAndrea leaving the bar, climbing into the van, the vehicle sitting motionless for an hour, the overwhelming DNA evidence showing a violent struggle, the blood that tied her last breaths to Washington's hands. They detailed his history: Los Angeles in the late 80s, multiple assaults in Texas, the rape and strangulation of another woman in Dallas just months before DeAndrea disappeared. They painted him as a man who had been hunting women for decades, a predator who counted on the silence of society to keep him free. The defense countered with cold precision. They argued that the DNA only proved she had been in the van, not that he had killed her. They suggested that perhaps another man had entered, that perhaps Washington had dropped her off alive, that perhaps the remains found in Dallas were unrelated until proven otherwise. They leaned heavily on the fact that there was no direct eyewitness to the murder itself, only a mountain of circumstantial evidence. For DeAndrea's family, every day of the trial was agony. Bridget sat quietly, clutching her Bible, while Kevin glared at Washington from across the courtroom, his anger simmering just below the surface. The little boy stayed home, too young to understand why strangers were talking about his mother in such cold, forensic terms. Too young to understand that her story was now evidence, her life reduced to exhibits and testimonies. Outside, supporters rallied in the hundreds. They weren't just demanding justice for DeAndrea, they were demanding justice for every woman like her, every dancer, every escort, every mother who took risks because she had no other choice. Her case had become a symbol of something bigger, and the pressure was mounting. The prosecution ended their arguments with a haunting truth. They played the surveillance footage one last time. DeAndrea, smiling faintly as she climbed into the van. They let the silence of that hour hang heavy in the courtroom. She never came out, the prosecutor told the jury, and she never came home. He was the last person to see her alive, and the blood in that van tells the rest of the story. The defense reminded the jury of doubt, repeating over and over that no one had seen the crime, that Washington's story, though implausible, could not be disproven entirely. They urged the jury to resist the emotional weight of the case. The deliberations stretched on. Hours turned into days. The family waited outside, praying, hoping, terrified that justice would once again slip away. Bridget whispered DeAndrea's name over and over, as if speaking it aloud might carry it into the ears of the jurors deciding her fate. What the jury would decide could either bring a measure of closure to a grieving family or reopen the wound that never healed. Would Washington finally face the consequences of nearly 4 decades of violence, or would he slip through the cracks once more? The courtroom doors remained closed. The tension was unbearable, and when the jury finally returned with their verdict, every heart in that room stopped beating for just a moment, waiting for the words that could change everything. The jury filed back into the courtroom with faces unreadable, eyes heavy with the burden of what they had just decided. Every shuffle of their shoes echoed like a drumbeat. Every second a lifetime for DeAndrea's family. Bridget sat frozen, her knuckles white around the edges of her Bible, her lips moving in silent prayer. Kevin stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, a storm of rage and grief bottled inside him. The room held its breath as the foreperson stood, paper in hand. "On the charge of capital murder," the voice announced, "we, the jury, find the defendant, The word hung suspended, and then it came crashing down. Guilty. The room erupted. Gasps, cries, muffled sobs. Bridget broke down, shoulders shaking as tears poured freely, while Kevin let out a cry somewhere between anger and relief. For months, they had lived in limbo, unsure if the system would finally hold a man like Washington accountable. And in that moment, with the single word of a jury, it felt as if justice had finally come, at least in part. Washington remained calm, too calm. He showed no emotion, no regret, no sign that the verdict carried any weight. To those who had watched him for weeks, it was as if he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He turned his gaze toward no one, eyes fixed somewhere distant, as if already plotting how to endure prison the same way he had endured freedom, cold, detached, and unrepentant. The sentencing phase began almost immediately. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, pointing to Washington's history. Decades of violence. Decades of women who had been silenced, broken, discarded. They argued that this wasn't just about DeAndrea, though she deserved every ounce of justice. This was about preventing him from ever harming another woman again. They painted him as the embodiment of predation, a man who had made hunting women his life's work. The defense fought desperately for life imprisonment instead, suggesting that execution would not bring DeAndrea back, that killing Washington would be a hollow act of revenge. But for DeAndrea's family, the argument was hollow. The very fact that he had been free after his first crimes in the 80 seconds was proof that imprisonment hadn't worked. He had slipped through cracks, he had been released, and he had killed again. To them, only the ultimate penalty could close the circle. When the jury returned once more, their decision was unanimous. Washington would face the death penalty. For some, it felt like balance. For others, it was simply another chapter of grief. Bridget whispered through tears, "He can never hurt another girl again." But the truth was, the damage had already been done. The aftermath rippled through Houston and beyond. News outlets covered the verdict for weeks, dissecting every angle of the case. Legal experts debated whether capital punishment was justice or vengeance, whether society had truly learned anything from DeAndrea's death. Activists demanded reform in witness protection, demanding that no other key witness be left so vulnerable, holding nothing but a piece of paper against men who wanted them dead. At community vigils, DeAndrea's name was spoken like a prayer. Candles flickered in the night as mothers held their daughters close, warning them of dangers that seemed to lurk everywhere. She deserved better, the signs read, and the phrase began to spread beyond Houston, beyond Texas, as a rallying cry. DeAndrea deserved better. For her little boy, life had shifted in ways too big to comprehend. He was now 5 years old enough to understand that mommy wasn't coming home, but too young to understand why. He slept in her room, clutched her pillow, and asked questions no one could answer. Bridget tried to fill the silence with stories about how much his mother loved him, about her laughter, about her dreams, but the boy's eyes, wide and searching, always carried the same unspoken question. If mommy loved me so much, why didn't she come back? And that question lingered not just for him, but for everyone who had followed the case. Why didn't she come back? Why wasn't she protected? Why did it take so long for justice to be served? Because the truth is, While Washington now faced death, the system that had allowed him to walk free for nearly 4 decades still remained. The verdict did not erase the failures that left DeAndrea exposed. It did not change the fact that her warnings had been ignored, that her danger had been documented and still unguarded, that a woman who wanted nothing more than to provide for her son was treated as if her life was disposable. The haunting reality of this case was not just that DeAndrea had been murdered, it was that she had been failed, again and again, by every layer of protection meant to shield her. And while the courtroom celebrated a guilty verdict, while society cheered at the thought of a predator finally facing execution, Bridget and Kevin knew that no sentence, no punishment, no verdict could ever bring back the woman they loved. For them, justice was not just a word. It was a reminder of everything they had lost, everything that should have been prevented, and everything society needed to change. And as Washington was led out of the courtroom for the final time, chains rattling at his wrists and ankles, one chilling thought lingered in the minds of everyone watching. If the system had done its job decades earlier, if he had been stopped in 1987, then DeAndrea Ford would still be alive today. In the days after the verdict, Houston felt both vindicated and hollow. A predator had finally been caged, condemned to death for what he had done, but the wound of DeAndrea's story cut deeper than any courtroom could heal. Outside the courthouse, crowds lit candles, held posters of her smiling face, and chanted her name as if willing her spirit back. The words painted on cardboard and whispered in vigils became a chorus. She deserved better. And that chorus carried far beyond the streets of Houston. Media outlets picked up her story as a symbol of systemic failure. Commentators debated whether witness protection in the United States was fundamentally broken. Advocacy groups spoke loudly about the way society treats women in professions considered dangerous or stigmatized. DeAndrea wasn't just a victim of one man. They argued she was a victim of a culture that looked at her choices and decided she was less worthy of protection. To her family, these weren't abstract arguments. They were the bitter truth they had lived through. They knew what it was like to beg for help, to waive court documents that declared she was in danger, and to watch the system shrug as if that danger was hers to manage alone. Her uncle Kevin became the family's voice, standing on street corners with megaphones, speaking to local news crews, repeating the same words over and over. They knew she wasn't safe. They knew, and they did nothing. His anger resonated with people who had their own stories of being ignored, of being judged, of being told their lives were not worth the resources it would take to protect them. For Bridget, the grandmother who had raised her, the fight was quieter but no less fierce. She kept DeAndrea's room exactly as it was, a shrine to the girl who grew into a mother too soon, a woman who fought to survive, and who fought with her last breath in the back of a stranger's van. The justice system had labeled Washington a predator, but what haunted the community was the timeline. He had been harming women since the 82nds. That meant countless chances for intervention, countless missed warnings, countless lives shattered. And if all those chances had been taken seriously, if the system had done its job decades earlier, DeAndrea's son would still have his mother. That realization burned. It demanded answers. And yet, outside the protests and the vigils, life moved on. The courthouse emptied. The reporters left. The city returned to its rhythm. But for the Ford family, time had stopped. Every morning, Bridget woke to the sound of her grandson calling out for his mom. Every night, She tucked him into the bed his mother once slept in, telling him that mommy was watching from heaven. The boy still didn't understand. He only knew that she was gone, and that everyone spoke her name in hushed tones, as though the air itself couldn't carry the weight of it. DeAndrea's case forced an uncomfortable question into the spotlight. Whose lives matter enough to protect? Witnesses in capital murder cases are supposed to be guarded, supported, given the means to stay alive long enough to testify. Yet all she received was a no-contact order, a piece of paper that carried no weight against men who had already plotted her death. She worked nights because she had bills, a child, and no safety net. She took risks because there was no other way forward. And when she disappeared, her history was dragged into the headlines, as if her choices excused her fate. But those who loved her pushed back hard. They reminded the world that she was more than the headlines, more than the whispers. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a friend, a mother. Her story ignited conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and courtrooms. People asked why women in nightlife jobs were treated as if they chose their own danger, as if their deaths were less shocking. Why men like Washington could build careers out of violence while slipping through loopholes, plea deals, and early releases. Why it took the loss of someone so young, so vibrant, for people to finally pay attention. But even as DeAndrea's case became a rallying cry, even as her name was painted on signs and spoken in chants, there was a nagging fear that the reckoning would fade. That once the cameras left, once the trial ended, once Washington was tucked away in a cell, nothing would truly change. That another young woman, somewhere else, in another city, would face the same risks, and the cycle would begin again. Because DeAndrea's tragedy wasn't just about one man. It was about the cracks in a system that treats some lives as fragile treasures and others as disposable inconveniences. It was about the silence of a society that looks away until the blood is already spilled. It was about the haunting truth that justice for one family cannot undo decades of injustice for so many others. In the quiet after the verdict, Bridget's words echoed like a final verdict of their own. We finally get to say goodbye, but we'll never get answers to why. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. That the why was never just about Washington. It was about us. The trial ended, the verdict was read, the sentence delivered. Yolande Washington was locked away, condemned to die for what he had done. On paper, justice had been served, but for DeAndrea's family, there was no justice that could balance the scales. There was only absence. A chair at the dinner table that would never again be filled. A child's birthday party where the guest of honor, his mother, would always be missing. A grandmother who tucked a boy into bed at night with the kind of love that could never replace a mother's embrace. The house where DeAndrea once lived still carried her spirit. Her son slept in her room, curled against her pillow, asking questions his family couldn't answer. Why didn't mommy come back? Why do people say she's in heaven? Why did the man hurt her? They tried to shield him, tried to soften the truth. But even at 5 years old, he understood something that cut deeper than words. She was gone, and the world hadn't protected her. Outside their home, life went on. The city of Houston returned to its restless rhythm. The bar where she worked opened its doors night after night. New faces walking in, new women dancing beneath neon lights. Somewhere, another young mother took a late-night shift. Another woman climbed into a stranger's car. Another family prayed their daughter would make it home. The cycle continued, as if the city had learned nothing from the girl whose name was now etched on protest signs and whispered in vigils. But DeAndrea's story refused to fade. It became a shadow, a warning, a reminder that predators like Washington do not hunt in isolation. There are thousands like him, men who exploit the cracks in the system, men who know exactly which women society looks away from, women who work nights, women who sell their time and their bodies to survive, women who are mothers, daughters, sisters, human beings who are treated as if their safety is a luxury they don't deserve. Washington counted on that silence. He counted on the system not caring enough. And for nearly 40 years, he was right. The tragedy of DeAndrea Ford is not just that she was murdered. It's that she was failed long before her final night. Failed when the justice system handed her a piece of paper instead of real protection. Failed when decades of red flags about Washington went ignored. Failed when society judged her choices instead of honoring her humanity. And in the end, that failure wasn't abstract. It had a name, a face, a laugh, a child left behind. Bridget says she talks to her granddaughter in dreams. She tells her she's sorry. Sorry she couldn't protect her. Sorry the world turned its back. Sorry her son will grow up without her. Kevin still posts her picture online every week, refusing to let the world forget, refusing to let her become just another statistic. And her little boy still asks when mommy is coming home, a question with no answer but tears. What happened to DeAndrea forces us to confront the darkest truth of all, that she is not alone. For every woman like her, there are predators waiting, and systems failing, and societies too willing to look away. The van that became her coffin is not unique. It's a symbol of a world where the vulnerable are left unprotected, and the powerful, even when known predators, slip through again and again. And so the question that remains is not what happened to DeAndrea Ford. We know that now. The real question is whether we will allow it to happen again. Whether we will let silence and stigma bury the next woman, the next mother, the next daughter, the next witness who dares to speak the truth. Because DeAndrea deserved better. And if we cannot admit that, if we cannot change, then her story is not a tragedy. It is a prophecy. This concludes the 6-part narration. It closes on a haunting reflection, but also leaves viewers unsettled thinking not just about DeAndrea, but about the countless others at risk.